Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112, Section 2. This is for our class for Tuesday, October 3rd. Believe it or not, we are in October. So what I wanted to do was to continue on talking about short story. And I have 3 short stories actually, so we're beginning to move a little bit faster. Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. Luckily, I was able to find links online for all 3 of these short stories. So you know I'll always provide the links whenever I have access to them. Last class, we talked a little bit about Rose for Emily, which I was also able to find a link for. But the interview with the author, William Faulkner, unfortunately, I could not find a link for. However, talking a little bit about that particular interview, his answers, from my perspective, seem to be rather unsatisfactory, at least based on the criteria that we've been talking about in terms of coming together with the literary analysis, which for us means a paper, and that would be around October 19th. I chose that date purely because it's about midway through the semester. That's a Thursday. I encourage early papers. Basically, it's a rolling deadline. So as soon as you have written your paper, you can submit it in to me. But if you haven't submitted it in a paper by the 19th, then I'm beginning to get a bit anxious because we're halfway through the semester without any formal assignments being submitted. So you should definitely let me know what's going on by that particular point. It's a critical paper, which means you should not be consulting with outside resources. You should basically be using your intellect and what you've learned in class. And it's approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately is approximately. And you would be writing about a short story from the fiction section. And I have suggested some possible topics in the syllabus and other documents folder. I always suggest that you might want to make a hard copy. I always prefer hard copies. And I deliberately chose topics that don't really require right or wrong perspective. These are topics that really require argumentation and reasoning. And the first couple of options were based upon the canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of literary study. So if you decided to pursue that option, you would be identifying a text from our fiction section that we've read and discussed that you believe should be included in the canon. In other words, it's a question that's asking about quality. Is there enough quality there to justify studying that text in an academic setting? From your perspective, of course, this is something that could be debated. You need to use evidence and details from the text in order to support your answer. Or you could identify a text that, from your perspective, should not be included in the literary canon. In other words, that you don't think is worth the effort or the time to be spending in an academic setting. And again, this is opinion based, but you would be using evidence and details from the text itself. We laid out some of the criteria for a strong piece of literature, that it's not formulaic. Unlike something like Faye and Kai and A Secret Sorrow, it isn't overly predictable. It is not simplistic. It requires thought and effort from the reader. It is creative and unique in one way or another. It usually has some sort of social statement or statements to make. And it usually has stood the test of time, or at the very least examines timeless and universal thoughts and ideas and themes. That said, there's a lot of different ways we could go about examining quality when it comes to canon. And if you decide that you don't want to tackle that, you could talk about contemporary relevance, which were the other 2 options that I gave you for you to identify a text in our fiction section that you believe still has contemporary relevance in our time period. Again, this is not a right or a wrong answer. This is based on argumentation. And you would be using evidence from the text. You don't want to lose control of the paper and start talking about our present time. Basically, you want to focus on the text itself and talk about why that's still applicable in our present time. Or you could do the opposite and identify a text from the fiction section that, from your opinion, does not have contemporary relevance. Again, focusing on the text itself with evidence and details. And I left you with the quote that is perhaps hard to aspire to, is a piece of writing said as gracefully and as believably as possible. And I had a very wise professor in college who once said that a piece of writing is never done. It's just at some point you've got to submit it in. I think that's true. So keep that in mind, that you are not necessarily aspiring to perfection. Everybody has the option of rewriting that first paper. So once you submit in that paper, I ask that you submit it in to me via PDF to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. I can evaluate it for content as well as grammar and mechanics, return it back to you with the letter grade. You're satisfied, you're done with the assignment. If you want to rewrite it for a higher grade, you certainly are able to. So you can do a revision. I just ask that you submit in along with your revision to me after you've incorporated my suggestions. And if you need additional direction, please reach out to me. That ultimately what you would be doing is submitting in the original with my comments on it along with your revisions, so I can compare and contrast the two. You would get the higher of the two grades. And honestly, this is the way professional writers write, is that they basically go through lots of edits and revisions and feedback. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to do that, but the sooner the better for everyone involved, for obvious reasons. And your second paper is going to be due at the very ending of the semester, and it's going to be about our next unit, which is drama. And I'm going to do the same thing, offer the same choices, or encourage you to create your own, as long as you get that topic approved by me, and as long as ultimately it's based on one of the readings that we've done in class. And the idea is that since you would be submitting that at the ending of the semester, there wouldn't be time for a revision, nor would you need one, because you would have learned how to write a paper through the first exercise. But again, it's a rolling deadline for paper number 2 as well. So in theory, one might be able to hand in that paper early enough and negotiate with me for a revision, but it's not guaranteed. Definitely for the first paper, it is guaranteed. So I'm hopeful that at this point in the semester, and I know it doesn't seem like we've been meeting for very long because this is a condensed semester, or at least it's a late start semester, which means that it's a condensed semester because ultimately we finish at the same time. I'm hopeful that we've already read enough passages or enough short stories that you have some possible ideas, whether or not you wanted to talk about A Sorrowful Woman, or whether or not you wanted to talk about The Story of an Hour, or whether or not you wanted to talk about A Rose for Emily. And today I'll introduce 3 more options for you: Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. And in terms of these 3 short stories, they're all very different from one another, and I did that on purpose. I wanted to give a kind of broad breadth of possibilities. Young Goodman Brown is a text that in some ways I think is historically important for us because it's set in New England, not just in New England, but in Massachusetts. So this gives us a sense of our time period. And in Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, you might recognize the name. He also wrote The Scarlet Letter, for instance. He talks a little bit about Puritanism, and it's important to understand Puritanism in order to really understand New England. The Puritans were a religious sect in England, and they faced all kinds of prosecution and discrimination. So they left England and they resettled into a new area so they could practice freely. That new area they called New England. That would be in America, specifically Massachusetts. The great irony is that one of the places they settled in was in Salem, Massachusetts. And you probably have some background about Salem, Massachusetts with its historical witch trials. What the Puritans did is what was done to them. They began to persecute individuals who did not necessarily follow their religious doctrines. Oftentimes they targeted women who were seen as outsiders and labeled them as witches. That led to the famous witch trials and the witch hysteria. And there's lots of sociological and psychological and historical reasons why this happened. But in terms of the Puritans, they believed in absolutes, absolute purity or absolute sin, very little ambiguity, very little in between. and that ultimately either an individual was destined for heaven because they lived a holy life, or they were destined for hell because they were it's sinful. And at the time, it was about depriving oneself about physical and earthly pleasures. This gives you just a tinge of an idea of what Puritanism would mean when we are reading Young Goodman Brown. And Young Goodman Brown is indeed a Puritan, and the story is about Puritanism. And you can tell from the title that he is young. And young is oftentimes associated with things like being innocent or naive. This is definitely a coming of age story. And Goodman is, yes, he's a good man, but he also would have had that title at the time period. It would have been much like Mr. And for women, they were known as Goody. So when you are referencing characters in Young Goodman Brown who are female, you might have noticed they'd be known as Goody, like Goody Cloyce. And this is an allegorical tale, which means it's representational, it's figurative. So yes, you can read it literally, but you're supposed to also read it from a representational standpoint. Universal ideas and themes. So, yes, Goodman Brown's wife, her name is Faith. So she's literally his wife. But she also represents Goodman's faith, his faith in humanity and his faith in Puritanism. And he's going on some journey that she tries to stop him from going on. And he proceeds. And along this journey, he meets somebody that would appear to be perhaps supernatural. It could even be a devil figure. And along this journey, Goodman sees all of the leading citizens of his town going to what appears to be a witch meeting. And Goodman is stunned and horrified that all of these holy, pious individuals would, in one way or another, be involved with something that could be evil. He even sees Faith there. And at that point, it would appear that there's a witch meeting that is in process, and then Goodman seemingly wakes up and no one is there. And perhaps from a reader's perspective, the main question is, was this a dream that Goodman had? In fact, the author even asked point blank, was this a dream of evil omen that Goodman Brown had? And the response is, be it so if you will. In other words, yeah, whatever. Because ultimately, it's unimportant. And you will never know for certain whether or not the events that occurred are real, or whether or not the events that occurred were a dream or a figment of Goodman's imagination or a representation of his subconscious. Every time there's a piece of evidence to prove that the events occurred, there's another piece of evidence to show that the events did not occur. That's done very deliberately. It's deliberately ambiguous. In other words, a clear-cut answer can't be found. When we were talking about literary critics, I was mentioning deconstructionists, those individuals who take apart a text, deconstruct it, to show contradiction, to show that there is no meaning. And this is a text, Young Goodman Brown, that lends itself very nicely to that. Because every time you seem to find an argument, let's say that the witch meeting occurred, there's another argument that the witch meeting did not occur. Because ultimately what matters is how Goodman is changed because of this realization that the holy and pious in his society have sinned, which would have been shocking at the time period for Puritans. Maybe less so now, but even today. Think about how difficult it is when you admire someone and they do something that's out of character, or they do something that you might consider to be sinful. Whether it be a parent, and every child has to go through this to learn that their parents are human beings and flawed individuals, or a teacher, or a clergy person, or a politician. Though I know we live in skeptical times, so perhaps the politician is a little bit less surprising. But you do get the idea. So this is definitely a coming-of-age story, and Goodman loses all of his faith in humanity, and we're not supposed to follow in his footsteps. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the major elements to consider in Young Goodman Brown. He's a newlywed. Of course, that represents that he's newly married, and again, innocence, naive. 3 months, no less, and 3 is oftentimes a Christian symbol for Trinity. And this is definitely a story about Christianity and religion. Even the fact that his surname is Brown, that brown suggests soiled or dirty, and it's not black or white, it's something in between. Notice that Goodman is in the wilderness where there are lots of browns as well and earth colors. So, at any rate, thinking about the next piece is called Soldier's Home, and I suspect it's probably an easier read, not only because it's more contemporary, 1925, though it still has age to it, but Ernest Hemingway is known for writing in a very different kind of style. So when we were talking about young Goodman Brown, you probably struggled with some of the more archaic language with the these and the thous and the so forth. Soldier's Home sounds much more contemporary, and Ernest Hemingway was known for being very concise and being very direct in his language. He didn't want to waste language. And he also used a good amount of dialogue, and all of that makes reading an Ernest Hemingway piece usually easier. It's one of the reasons why watching a film is easier than, let's say, reading, because a film or a television show is filled with dialogue. And you can probably tell from the title, Soldier's Home, that it's about a soldier who's home. Now, this piece in 1925 would be in direct response to World War I, which would have been viewed as the war to end all wars, without any understanding that this was not the ending to World War. There would be a World War II. There would also be an atom bomb and all kinds of other atrocities. But at least up until this point, this was perhaps one of the most horrific things that had been seen from a global perspective. And at the time period, serving in the military would have been basically presented as one's patriotic duty. And it would have been presented in a rather simplistic way, that the military was an opportunity to serve one's country and to gain honor and respect and esteem. And then one would return home and basically return back to normalcy without any real consequences. And of course, in our contemporary time, in 2023, we know there are lots of consequences. We have language for this. PTSD, for instance. The term didn't exist during the time of Soldier's Home, though there was a term known as shell shock, which was beginning to describe the difficulties of reintegrating back into society. And that's what this particular piece is. It's about reintegrating back into society, or trying to, once a soldier returns back from war. And what exactly is home? And there is a difference between a house, the physical structure, and a home where one feels understood. Now, Ernest Hemingway, the author, had actually served in the war as an ambulance driver, and he saw some of the most bloody battles that had occurred. So perhaps we can see some correlation, though we always have to be careful with biographical information with an author. There's not necessarily a direct correlation to their writing. They are writing fiction. Nathaniel Hawthorne, going back to young Goodman Brown, a New Englander, or was a New Englander, I should say. And in fact, he had ancestors who were involved in the Salem witch trials, much to his horror and shame. And that seems to make sense on some levels based on the kinds of writings that Hawthorne has done, certainly based on something like Young Goodman Brown. So this idea of what does it mean to try to reintegrate back into society. I love that the main character is usually referenced by his last name, Krebs. This is how one is usually referenced in the military, by the surname. That takes away individuality. It also, in German, means cancer. One could say that war in and of itself is a kind of cancer. And we see how Krebs is a changed man upon his return. He questions everything about his former life. We know he went to a Methodist college. We were told that at the beginning. Yet by the ending of the story, when his mother asks him to pray, he says he can't. So the war has obviously influenced his own faith and his belief in God. The idea that getting a job and settling down, and as his parents say, getting a girl, are considered to be, quote, normal, unquote, in society, is something that's very difficult for Krebs to even fathom at this point in time, because he's not ready. He's trying to avoid consequences. And of course, the war came with lots of consequences. And this idea of ultimately having to reintegrate back into society, and this is a complex text, of course, he does need to reintegrate. So we can certainly empathize with the need for him to be a productive member of society as his family wants him to be, but we can also empathize with Krebs, who's really not ready to, spending most of his time doing really individualistic kinds of activities, reading about the war, no less. This is where he gets validation. Playing the clarinet, Playing pool, so significant here because in pool you aim and shoot. Again, Hemingway being very specific about what he's doing. And of course, in the military, you also aim and shoot, albeit for a different purpose. And while Krebs talks about how he enjoys looking at girls, he doesn't really want to have a committed relationship. And note that the assumption is that he will settle down and marry a woman. That's really the only option his parents consider, heterosexual relationship. This is quite indicative of the time period, 1925. So these pieces, I think, also give us a historical lens about the expectations, just like it was assumed that soldiers would all be male during this time period. And the perhaps strangest thing, since this is a dialogue driven text, is the conversation that he has with his sister. Perhaps his young sister, who's a child, has the most respect for Krebs. It's certainly a kind of hero worship, more so than even his own community, who feels that he's returned back from the military too late, so he doesn't deserve a hero's welcome, as if that in any way the timeline in which he returns that influences his service. But nevertheless, his sister at one point asks, will you be my beau? And beau means boyfriend. And he says yes. And this is not an incestual dialogue. She's basically asking in a very innocent hero worship kind of way, will you be my boyfriend? And he says yes, because he knows that there are no real consequences. It's not possible. So certainly they can pretend. It would be very different in an adult situation. It's one of the things that he says about the German girls that he misses about them, that there wasn't all this conversation. Chances are the German girls spoke little to no English, as opposed to the American girls who probably speak quite a bit of English and want to have conversations, and Krebs doesn't want to have a conversation. And he vacillates back and forth between wanting to tell people about the war and not wanting to tell people about the war, and he's frustrated and dissatisfied with both. At the ending of the story, Krebs ultimately decides that he will appease his parents and that he will get a job and settle down, but he will move to Kansas City to do that. Lots of different ways we could see this ending. We could see this as perhaps cowardice, that Krebs is running away from his problems. We could see this as perhaps Krebs getting the best that he can manage in this impossible situation, knowing that he can never satisfy his parents, so he may as well just go off to a different locale and try to start a new life. And that's the greatness of literature, is that it oftentimes comes with ambiguity. You can have two possibilities, even 4 or 5 possibilities at the same time. So that said, one of the things about Soldier's Home that we really have to consider, in addition to all of the detail, something like the parents emphasizing that Krebs can drive the car is so important, because a car represents freedom, something that Krebs was not allowed to do before, which was drive the car. But Krebs is quite well aware that the car comes with, strings. And they expect him to use the car, so he will settle down and get a job, so to speak. You may have noticed or not noticed that Krebs never has a direct conversation with his father. It's always through the mother, so who works as a kind of mouthpiece, a translator. So this puts a certain level of distance between Krebs and his father. But sadly, if we talk about literature being about timeless and universal concerns, I've never taught Soldier's Home without there being at least one war happening on the planet, usually multiple wars. My hope is that one day I can teach this story and say there is no war on the planet. But the reality is that seems quite far-fetched. So that in and of itself is a reason to read this story, is because of how timeless and universal it is. As well as the idea that I think many people can relate to leaving home and then coming back and realizing that things are different, because you're different. Whether you're leaving home because you are going to college, or you're leaving home because you are relocating, or whatever the case may happen to be. But certainly this piece is directly related to the stressors and the traumas that Krebs would have experienced in war. And again, this would have been quite eye-opening to the audience at the time, because you just didn't talk about these things in 1925. Just like in Hawthorne's time, you just didn't talk about the possibility that everyone could have evil within them. Even young Goodman Brown, because he wouldn't be on this journey if there wasn't something wrong. Faith tries to hold him back, and yet he insists on continuing. So even he is somewhat soiled, shall we say, even though he refuses to believe it. So the third story that I wanted to talk about today would be Battle Royal. This one might be the most challenging one because it comes from a novel entitled Invisible Man. Not The Invisible Man, not the science fiction story of somebody who makes himself invisible, but Invisible Man. It was a piece written in the late 40s, early 50s, and it's about a black narrator who is nameless. We've talked about this a little bit with previous stories, like A Sorrowful Woman. When you don't have names, it takes away individuality. But basically, when we are talking about something like Invisible Man, what we are talking about is someone who feels they are invisible because they are black and only seen for their ethnicity and not seen for their individuality. And the novel is, in my opinion, perhaps one of the best novels ever written. If we had time in class, we would read it. The difficulty is that we don't have time in class. It's over 400 pages. But the good news is that the first chapter of the novel was released as a short story entitled Battle Royal, and that we can read and that we can talk about. Now, obviously, this short story will make a lot more sense if you read the novel in its entirety. So I encourage you to read the novel in its entirety one day. And one of the reasons why I think so highly of the novel is because it reads like a short story. Every detail counts, even though it's hundreds and hundreds of pages long. That said, I think you can still get an overall sense of what's happening in Battle Royal, and then I can fill in the gaps for you with what happens with the novel as a whole. Understand that this is a rather simplistic overview of a novel, my summary. But basically, our narrator is telling us about why he feels invisible, and that this goes back to his youth when he graduated from high school. So this is an adult who's thinking back onto his youth. And he talks a little bit about how he gave a speech at his high school, and it was so well regarded, the speech, that he's been asked to deliver this speech to the leading citizens of the town. And the Invisible Man is quite excited because this is an opportunity for him to prove his intelligence and perhaps an opportunity for him to gain respect and even a level of equality. So he goes to deliver the speech, and he finds out basically that it was a huge setup. And when he arrives, what he finds out is that there has been a literal boxing match set up for the Invisible Man to participate in with his peers. And the boxing match is symbolic about the battles that the disenfranchised face every day, that they are forced to fight each other rather than fight the people who are truly in power. And prior to the actually engaging in that physical battle, which is very brutal and ugly, the entire story is very brutal and ugly, but racism is brutal and ugly. What ends up happening is that the men are taunted with a naked blonde woman who's treated like a piece of meat, basically. So this piece is as much about sexism as it is about racism. She happens to have a tattoo of American flag tattooed on her navel. That'll be important. From a symbolic perspective. At any rate, looking at a white woman could get a black man killed during this time period. Certainly looking at a naked white woman could get a black man killed. They are all dressed ready for this boxing match in boxing shorts. And that's all they're wearing. And the boxing shorts do a very poor job of hiding the physical excitement these men experience when they see this naked woman. So they're degraded and they're humiliated. And then, of course, after the boxing match, which is bloody and miserable, they're told that they'll be compensated with money for their efforts if they go and scramble for pieces of gold on a rug. They go onto the rug, and it turns out the rug has been electrified. Electricity is a major theme throughout the entire novel because electricity is power. And it's about who has power, who doesn't have power. And outside of being electrified, they find out it's not real money anyway. They're just tokens for a car dealership. Now, finally, after all of this humiliation and pain, the Invisible Man can give his speech. And he's still excited over the fact that perhaps he could gain honor and respect. And no one is listening to him. Everyone is drunk, and everyone is basically enjoying themselves. These are the leading citizens of the town, the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers. It almost reminds me of young Goodman Brown, when Goodman Brown is on his journey and sees some of the most holy, pious people along the way. But at any rate, the Invisible Man gives a speech and no one listens until the Invisible Man makes a mistake. He's supposed to say social responsibility. Instead, he says social equality. There's a big difference between social responsibility and social equality. Well, everything comes to a standstill at that point. And basically, he has to justify what he said. He says that it was an error. He was swallowing blood. That's both literal because he is swallowing blood from the boxing match. But it's also figurative, the idea of having to say something that you may not necessarily want to say, but that's what's expected in that context, is known as swallowing blood. And then finally, at the ending of this, he's, quote, rewarded, unquote, by being given a briefcase. Think about all of the symbols associated with the briefcase. Professional success, for instance. And within this briefcase is a scholarship to the, quote, Negro College, unquote. And the Invisible Man is thrilled. Now, this is going to be an opportunity for him to get an education. And he goes home, but then he has a terrible nightmare about his grandfather. And we're told about his grandfather ahead of time, that his grandfather died when the Invisible Man was young, and he never quite understood what happened when his grandfather died, because on the grandfather's deathbed, the grandfather confessed that he had been lying his entire life. I guess if you're ever going to tell the truth, you do it on your deathbed. And that he was only pretending to be humble and meek and subservient. And the reality is that he was just doing that so he could gain access to power and control in a society that wouldn't give him power or control because of the color of his skin. The Invisible Man didn't really understand what that meant, but the dream, the nightmare the Invisible Man has, suggests that maybe the Invisible Man is beginning to understand what that means after what he's experienced with giving his speech. Because in that dream, the grandfather taunts him and says that he's going to be kept running. In fact, the N-word is used as well. So again, this is a very ugly, difficult text. But think about the time period. It really does give us a historical lens into what people thought and what people said at that time. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that the story ends for us. But I can tell you a little bit about the novel, which I will do now just to give you some context. Because the Invisible Man goes to college for the next 100 or 200 pages or so. And he believes that if he can get an education, he can have opportunity, and he can have respect, and he can have dignity, and maybe even some shreds of equality. He finds out that's all a lie. That although education makes those promises are not available to people like him because of the color of his skin. And then he makes a decision that because the educational system is rigged, in effect, he's going to enter the political system and try to change the political system from the bottom up. And he does that for another 100, 200 pages or so, and he realizes the political system is just as rigged, if not more so, as the educational system. That the promise, all men are created equal, is not indeed the case. And note that even in that promise, all men are created equal, 50% of the populace has been omitted. So then the Invisible Man meets a very aptly named character by the name of Ross the Destroyer. And he is a destroyer. And Ross tells the Invisible Man that he's been doing it all wrong. The answer isn't education or politics. It's revolt and revolution. And that basically what they need to do is to dismantle society and build it anew, which is what the Invisible Man tries to do with Ross the Destroyer for the next 100, 200 pages or so. The result, and this is towards the ending of the novel, is that they've instigated this huge riot, and what they see is their community burning around them. And what Invisible Man realizes is that this isn't helping. If anything, it's hurting his people, his community, and hurting himself. So he decides that he needs to think. Specifically, he uses the word hibernate. He wants to hibernate. And think about what hibernation means. It means you go to sleep, but then you wake up and then you continue on. And what Invisible Man does is that he goes to an old Caucasian neighborhood that he would never be allowed in because of the color of his skin. And he breaks into one of the apartment buildings, and he breaks into the basement. And the basement is filled with darkness, and that's symbolic. But the Invisible Man hooks up all of these electric lights so that he's surrounded by light. And darkness and light, major themes in the novel. But again, light is also a reference to power. He's stealing from the electric company or the power company. So that's something that's embedded throughout the text. And he's thinking about what is the way to achieve some level of dignity in a society that will not afford him dignity, some level of equality in a society that will not afford him equality. And we aren't given an answer. Because the author wants us as reader to contemplate. It would be too easy to give us an answer. If there was an answer, we would have solved this issue and we wouldn't be talking about it in 2023. Obviously, things have changed since the 40s and the 50s. I doubt that the author, Ralph Ellison, could have ever anticipated that we could have had a black president. So yes, things have changed. But as much as things have changed, they've also remained the same. We still see the ugly underbelly of racism and sexism and classism with no easy answers in sight. I'd like to hope and think that it's texts like this one, Invisible Man, that help to inspire some of the changes that we've experienced and that art can continue to do so. But this gives you a little bit of an idea of 3 very different stories that I had selected. And since last class, I had asked you to identify a important quote and why you thought it was important. So this is opinion-based. It doesn't even have to be an important quote. It's an important quote from your perspective and why you think it's important. Today's attendance question will be about one of these 3 short stories. So you get to choose. It can either be Young Goodman Brown, or it could be Soldier's Home, or it could be Battle Royal. The idea is that you choose one of these short stories and you select a quote that you think has significance or relevance and briefly talk about why. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses, my responses in turn, because I respond to everyone. That'll give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class. So what I'm going to do next class is to put closure onto these 3 short stories, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, and move to the last 2 stories in our fiction unit. That happens to be Girl and Popular Mechanics. You might be happy to know that both of them are about 1.5 pages long or so they are very short indeed. And also talk about some of the conventions of how to write a paper. So now that you're thinking about possibilities, I hope, for your first paper, I wanted to at least review some of the conventions for writing a paper. And some of this is included in your textbook as well, and some of the earlier readings that I had assigned. I'm aware that many of you didn't have necessarily access to the book at the beginning of the semester, but my hope is that by this point you have, so that you can go back to some of those readings. And again, I'm hopeful this is more review than anything, that you would have talked about how to write a paper in your English Composition 1 class. But again, I'll talk about some of the conventions and how we will start shifting into the drama section, which will be our next unit. And dramas are very different from short stories. If nothing else, they're much longer. So this means that we've got multiple classes devoted to each drama. And dramas are meant to be performed, which means that we will be watching production as well as reading dramas. But watching a production is never a substitute for reading and interpreting as well. So you do both. It's not one or the other. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the drama section. But in terms of the attendance question, so that would be due on Thursday. And of course, if you need an extension, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. Next class, as I said, we'll finish up these short stories. We'll see whether or not we can finish Girl and Popular Mechanics. Even if we can't, I encourage you to keep up with the reading on the course outline because I'll catch up soon enough. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And honestly, I, this past weekend, had my booster shot. And I can tell you that yes, I was a little tired, and yes, I was a little bit achy, but it was well worth the effort. We certainly don't want to repeat 2020 all over again. So I do encourage you to get your booster shot. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about short story and writing papers, of course. Take care. Bye bye.